The wind blowing off the harbor in Boston did not just chill the air. It carried a damp, heavy cold that cut right through fabric. Mabel Cooper pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her frame, but the material was far too old to stop the freezing breeze. She stood on the corner of Tremont Street, watching the breath rise from her lips in pale clouds, while the scent of warm bread from a nearby kitchen mocked her empty stomach. It had been 3 weeks since her father passed away, leaving her with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a name that former friends now avoided. Mabel had learned very quickly how fast people turned away when the money ran out, leaving a 22-year-old woman to fend for herself in a city that did not care about her survival. She had precisely 1 nickel left in her pocket, which was not enough for a meal and a room, forcing her to choose between freezing under the stars or starving under a roof. She walked into the public reading room at the local library simply because it was free, and the large iron radiators threw off a reliable wave of heat. She sat at a long oak table and picked up a discarded copy of the daily newspaper, pretending to scan the columns so the security guard would leave her alone. Her eyes skitted past the announcements of high society parties and expensive imports until she noticed a tiny, plain advertisement tucked away in the back corner of the page. The notice stated that a gentleman living in rural Maine required a wife of good character and quiet habits, offering a monthly allowance of $50 to her family name with no dowry expected. Mabel read the short sentences 3 times, her fingers tracing the printed ink as she realized $50 would completely pay off her father's smallest debts and keep the local banks from taking his memory away. The location was remote, far from the familiar streets of Massachusetts, and the ad said absolutely nothing about the man himself, treating the position more like a hiring notice for a housekeeper than a marriage. Mabel stood up, carefully tore the small square of paper from the page, and walked out into the falling sleet to find the office listed at the bottom. The address led her to a narrow brick building near the courthouse, where a lawyer named Mr. Thomas Finch sat behind a desk covered in heavy law books. Mr. Thomas Finch was a thin man with large spectacles that made his eyes look far too big for his face, and he looked Mabel up and down with a cold, practical gaze. He noted the fraying edges of her sleeves and the way her cheeks looked slightly hollow, but his voice remained perfectly flat and businesslike as he began to explain the terms of the arrangement. He told her that her future husband was a man named Jasper Montgomery, a person who lived in complete isolation at a large estate called Silverwood, Crest, and required a legal marriage to secure his family property. Mr. Thomas Finch assured her that it was strictly a legal transaction, that she would have her own private rooms, and that the money would be sent to her creditors the moment she signed her name. Mabel looked at the pen in her hand, thought of the empty kitchen waiting for her in Boston, and signed the paper before the ink could dry. The train ride north took 2 full days, the view out the window shifting from crowded brick factories to endless miles of dark pine trees and gray stone hills. By the time the hired carriage turned through the iron gates of Silverwood Crest, the sky had turned the color of a wet slate shingle, and the wind was howling through the branches. The house was a massive structure of dark stone, with large windows that reflected the dull light and thick vines climbing up the sides of the empty porch. It looked completely abandoned, with no smoke coming from the chimneys and no lights burning in the front rooms to welcome a traveler. The driver dropped her single wooden trunk into the gravel, refused to help her to the porch, and drove his horses away as fast as they could run. Mabel stood on the wide stone steps alone, her breath freezing in the air as she reached out to knock on the heavy wooden door. The door swung open with a slow creak, revealing an old butler with a severe face and a sharp, quiet voice that matched the coldness of the hallway behind him. The old man introduced himself as Barnaby, telling her he handled the cooking, the cleaning, and the horses, before gesturing for her to step inside out of the wind. The interior of the house was freezing, with sheets covering the large furniture in the parlor, and dust dancing in the faint light that managed to filter through the heavy curtains. Mabel asked where Mr. Jasper Montgomery was, her voice sounding thin and small in the vast, empty foyer that felt more like a cavern than a home. Barnaby told her that the master of the house remained in the north wing, and did not wish to be bothered under any circumstances, suggesting she go straight to her room. Mabel did not listen to the advice. She had not traveled all this way through the winter cold just to be hidden away in a spare bedroom like a piece of unwanted luggage. She walked down the long, dark corridor toward the north wing, following the faint sound of a crackling fire until she reached a pair of heavy oak doors. She pushed them open without knocking, stepping into a large library where the heavy velvet drapes were pulled completely shut against the afternoon light. The only illumination came from a low fire in the hearth, throwing long shadows across thousands of books piled on the floor and tables. Behind a large desk sat a man with hair as white as fresh snow, his skin so pale it seemed to catch the glow of the firelight like polished marble. He was writing quickly in a leather ledger, his movements incredibly smooth and silent as he ignored her presence entirely. Mabel cleared her throat, stepping closer to the desk to force him to look at her, refusing to let the strange coldness of the room scare her away. Jasper Montgomery slowly raised his head, and Mabel felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw his eyes, which were a dark, intense shade that seemed completely unnatural. He was a tall man, filling the space behind the desk, with an energy that made the entire room feel smaller and more dangerous. He told her that he had explicitly informed Barnaby he was not to be disturbed, his voice a low, smooth baritone that sounded like stones rolling under deep water. Mabel stood her ground, telling him her name, and reminding him that they were now legally married, even if they had never spoken a word to one another before this moment. Jasper Montgomery stood up, moving with a speed that was almost impossible to follow with the human eye, and stopped just a few feet away from her. He looked down at her, noting her small stature, and told her that she looked like she had not eaten a proper meal in an entire year. Mabel told him she was doing just fine, her voice sharp as she tried to hide the trembling in her hands, caused by the intense cold radiating from him. Jasper Montgomery let out a short, dry laugh that had no real warmth in it, telling her that Silverwood Crest was rich in cold stone, but poor in everything else. He told her to stay out of his wing of the house, to stay out of the lower cellars, and to leave the old building exactly as she found it, because he preferred the quiet ruin. Mabel asked him if there was to be no conversation or shared life between them, shocked by the complete absence of any human kindness in his words. He leaned down slightly, and she caught the faint scent of winter air and cedar wood, his pale face inches from her own as he spoke. He told her that this was a legal deal, that she received her money, and he received the signature he needed to satisfy his family lawyers, warning her never to mistake the arrangement for a romance. The weeks passed in a quiet, predictable pattern that felt more like living in an empty museum than a functional household. Mabel rarely saw her husband during the daylight hours, catching only occasional glimpses of a white-haired figure, walking through the pine trees at twilight, or standing on the balcony under the moonlight. She spent her mornings exploring the western side of the house, refusing to sit idly in her room while the dust settled around her. She found an old bucket, some rough soap, and a stack of clean rags in the kitchen pantry and began to wash the grime from the wood paneling herself. Barnaby watched her from the kitchen doorway, but did not offer to help, his old face remaining unreadable as she worked until her arms ached. Underneath the years of neglect, she discovered beautiful cherry wood floors and small, elegant stone fireplaces that had been completely forgotten by the world outside. The nights were the true problem, filled with strange noises that kept Mabel awake long after the fire in her bedroom had died down to gray ash. Silverwood Crest was supposed to be an isolated refuge for a man who hated society, yet she began to notice signs of activity that did not make sense. On 3 separate occasions during her second week, she heard the distinct sound of heavy wheels grinding against the gravel driveway in the middle of the night. She would look out her window into the pitch blackness, seeing no lamps lit on the carriage, only the dark shapes of horses moving silently through the mist. One Tuesday evening, when the wind was rattling the loose window panes so loudly she could not sleep, she wrapped her wool shawl around her shoulders and left her room. She walked silently down the grand staircase, her bare feet making no sound on the wood as she followed the murmur of voices coming from the main hall. She peered through the wooden slats of the balcony railing, looking down into the entry hall where Jasper Montgomery stood near the front door. He was not wearing his usual rough traveling coat. He was dressed in an elegant black suit that looked expensive enough to buy a block of houses in Boston. His white hair was neatly combed, and his pale skin looked almost translucent under the single candle burning on the side table. He was speaking to a man she recognized instantly from her days in Boston high society, a wealthy merchant named Sir William. Sir William was a man who had worked closely with her father before the gambling debts ruined their family name and forced them into poverty. Mabel held her breath, her heart hitting her ribs like a trapped bird, as she listened to the conversation happening below. Jasper was speaking in a tone that was completely different from his usual cold murmur. It was the voice of a ruler, filled with a quiet authority that demanded absolute attention. He told Sir William that the secret crates must be moved away from the Boston harbor before the local authorities began their winter inspections. He mentioned that a man named Richard Garrick was trying to track the shipments, using the debts of local families to force people into giving up information about the Montgomery line. Sir William looked nervous, his hands shaking as he adjusted his hat, and told Jasper that Richard Garrick was getting closer to discovering the truth about his family. Jasper told him that the truth would stay buried in the North Woods, and that Richard Garrick would find nothing but empty warehouses if he tried to interfere with their people. The two men walked out into the cold night, leaving Mabel alone on the stairs with her mind spinning from what she had just discovered. She realized that her husband was not a ruined gentleman hiding from his debts. He was someone with immense power, running a hidden network that involved some of the wealthiest men in New England. She also realized that the man he had mentioned, Richard Garrick, was the very same person who had taken her father's business and driven him to despair. She sat on the cold step for a long time, trying to understand why a wealthy leader would pretend to be a broke recluse in the middle of Maine. The next morning, she decided she was done playing the part of the quiet wife who asked no questions and stayed in her room. She walked down to the dining room at 8 o'clock, finding Jasper sitting at the head of the long table with a single silver cup in front of him. She sat down directly across from him, refusing to wait for Barnaby to serve her, and looked straight into his dark eyes. She told him that she had found a crate of expensive imported glassware in the cellar, items that a poor man could never afford to keep in his house. She looked at his pale hands, noting that he never seemed to touch the bread or the fruit that Barnaby left on the sideboard every morning. Jasper tensed, his white hair catching the morning light as he set his silver cup down on the dark wood with a sharp click. He told her that curiosity was a very dangerous trait for a woman in her position, his voice dropping into that low rumble that made the air feel heavy. Mabel leaned forward, telling him that she knew he was speaking with Sir William past midnight, and she knew he was tracking Richard Garrick. The silence in the dining room became so intense that Mabel could hear the steady ticking of the grandfather clock out in the hallway. Jasper did not move for several seconds, his pale face resembling a statue as he stared at her with an expression that was completely unreadable. Then, he stood up with that terrifying, fluid speed, walking around the long table until he was standing directly behind her chair. He placed his hands on the carved wood, his fingers cold enough that she could feel the chill right through the back of her dress. He told her that she had no idea what kind of world she had stepped into when she signed that contract in Boston. Mabel turned her head to look up at him, refusing to let him see the fear that was making her chest tighten with every breath. She told him that she knew Richard Garrick was a thief who had destroyed her father's life, and she wanted to know why her husband was involved with such a man. Jasper leaned down, his dark eyes fixed on hers, and told her that he had chosen her name from Mr. Thomas Finch's list for that exact reason. He explained that he needed a wife from a family that Richard Garrick would never suspect of being connected to the Montgomery estate. He told her that his family was different, that they had lived in the shadows for generations to protect themselves from men who feared what they could not understand. He pulled a small iron key from his pocket and set it on the table, telling her that they were leaving for Boston within the hour, because her presence here was no longer a secret. He told her that Richard Garrick had people watching the roads, and she was no longer safe at Silverwood Crest, now that she knew too much. Mabel stood up, her anger rising to meet his cold determination as she asked him if he was simply using her as a shield against his enemies. Jasper looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction, revealing a weariness that looked centuries old behind his youthful features. He told her that he was trying to keep her alive, and that the only way to do that was to face Richard Garrick in the city where everything had started. They packed their few belongings in less than 20 minutes, leaving the large stone house behind as the carriage sped down the muddy driveway toward the train station. The journey back to Boston was completely silent, with Jasper staring out the window at the passing trees, his pale skin looking even whiter against the dark velvet of the carriage seat. Mabel watched him, noticing for the first time that he did not seem to breathe in the regular, steady way that normal people did. They arrived in Boston under the cover of a thick evening fog that rolled off the Atlantic, turning the gas lamps into dim halos of orange light. The carriage did not take them to a hotel. Instead, it drove down a quiet, narrow lane in the Back Bay district, stopping in front of a plain brick townhouse. Jasper unlocked the front door himself, moving her trunk into the small hallway before locking 3 separate iron bolts behind them. The house was small but beautifully furnished, with heavy rugs on the floors and thick drapes that completely blocked the view from the street outside. Jasper told her that this was his safe house, a place where no one in the city knew he stayed when he had business with the shipping merchants. He turned to her, his white hair striking against the dark wallpaper, and told her that they were going to a winter ball at the Garrick mansion the following evening. Mabel stared at him in disbelief, reminding him that she was considered a disgraced woman in Boston society because of her father's financial ruin. Jasper walked over to a wooden cabinet, pulled out a small velvet box, and opened it to reveal a heavy necklace of emeralds and silver that looked older than the city itself. He told her that she was now the mistress of the Montgomery estate and that she would walk into that ballroom looking like a queen. He explained his plan, telling her that she would find Richard Garrick in the crowd and confront him publicly about the money he had stolen from her father. He said that the distraction would draw every eye in the house away from the private study upstairs, allowing him to slip inside and take the shipping ledgers. Mabel looked at the green stones glittering in the box, realizing that this was her one chance to get justice for her father's memory. She took the necklace from his cold fingers, her skin tingling where his touch met hers, and told him that she would play her part perfectly. Jasper looked down at her for a long moment, his hand resting near her cheek without quite touching her skin, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart race. He told her that if anything went wrong during the evening, she must leave the house immediately and take the train back to the North Woods alone. He told her that Richard Garrick was a dangerous man who would not hesitate to harm her if he discovered what they were trying to do. Mabel told him that she was not afraid of Richard Garrick and that she would see the plan through to the very end, regardless of the risk. The gowns that Jasper had provided for her were made of heavy dark green silk that rustled against the floor with every step she took. Mabel stood in front of the tall mirror in the townhouse bedroom, watching her reflection as she fastened the emerald necklace around her neck. The deep green stones looked brilliant against her skin, making her look like she belonged in the wealthy homes of Beacon Hill, rather than the cold library in Maine. She could hear Jasper moving downstairs, his steps so quiet they sounded like a light breeze passing through an empty room. When she came down the stairs, he was waiting for her in the entry hall, dressed in a formal black suit that made his white hair look like silver under the gaslight. He looked up at her, his dark eyes widening slightly as he took her hand to lead her out to the waiting carriage. The Garrick mansion was a massive building of red brick and white marble, with dozens of windows throwing bright light out onto the snow-covered lawn. Carriages lined the street for blocks, dropping off the wealthiest families in Boston, all of them dressed in velvet, silk, and gold jewelry. Mabel felt a familiar knot form in her stomach as they stepped out of the carriage, remembering how these same people had looked at her after her father died. Jasper gave her arm a gentle squeeze, his touch cold but steady, reminding her that she was no longer the starving girl from Tremont Street. They walked up the wide marble steps together, their names announced by the butler at the door. As they entered the grand ballroom, a quiet murmur spread through the crowd as people noticed Jasper's striking white hair and the elegant woman standing at his side. Mabel scanned the room until she spotted Richard Garrick standing near a large ice sculpture at the far end of the ballroom, surrounded by local politicians. He was a large man with a thick neck and small, greedy eyes that seemed to count the value of everything he looked at. Mabel took a deep breath, released Jasper's arm, and began to walk across the polished floor, her green silk dress catching the light of the massive chandeliers. She stopped directly in front of Richard Garrick, interrupting a conversation he was having with a city alderman, and spoke in a clear, loud voice that carried across the music. She told him that she had come to collect the balance of the business accounts he had stolen from her father before his passing. The musicians hesitated, the violins dying down to a quiet hum as the surrounding guests turned to see who was causing the disturbance. Richard Garrick's face turned a deep, angry red as he adjusted his collar and looked down at her with a look of pure contempt. He told her that her father was a fool who had lost his money because he did not know how to manage his affairs in a changing city. Mabel did not back away. She raised her hand and threw her glass of water straight into his face, the cold liquid dripping down his silk vest in front of 50 people. The ballroom erupted into shouts of surprise as Richard Garrick wiped his eyes, his voice shaking with rage as he called for his personal security guards to remove her from the house. In the middle of the shouting and the confusion, Mabel looked back toward the entrance, noticing that Jasper had already disappeared through the side doors leading to the private offices upstairs. Jasper moved through the upper hallways of the mansion like a shadow, his white hair the only thing visible in the dim light of the servants' corridors. He reached the door of Richard Garrick's private study, his cold fingers working the lock with a speed that took less than 10 seconds to click open. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old paper, with a large iron safe sitting in the corner behind a heavy leather armchair. Jasper did not need a key. He placed his ear against the metal door, his supernatural senses allowing him to hear the tiny clicks of the tumblers turning inside the mechanism. He pulled the safe door open, revealing stacks of money and a thick leather ledger that contained the records of every illegal shipment coming through the harbor. He tucked the book inside his coat, but as he turned to leave, his eyes caught a piece of stationery sitting open on the main desk. The letter was written in the distinctive, neat handwriting of Mr. Thomas Finch, the lawyer who had arranged their marriage back in Boston. The note informed Richard Garrick that Jasper Montgomery had taken the bait and married the Cooper girl, just as they had planned from the beginning. It stated that Mr. Thomas Finch would ensure Jasper stayed in the North Woods until Richard Garrick could secure the remaining shipping lines in the city. Jasper's blood went entirely cold as he realized that the entire marriage advertisement had been a trap designed by his enemies to keep him away from Boston. He realized that Richard Garrick had known about his identity from the very start, and that Mabel was currently standing downstairs in a room filled with his men. He bolted out of the study, abandoning all attempts at silence as he raced down the stairs to find his wife. Jasper burst through the double doors of the ballroom, just as the crowd was beginning to settle back into their quiet conversations. He scanned the room with desperate speed, his dark eyes searching the groups of guests, until he realized that the green silk dress was nowhere to be seen. He grabbed a young waiter by the arm, his grip so cold the boy nearly dropped his tray of glasses, and demanded to know where the woman in green had been taken. The terrified waiter pointed toward the rear exit of the house, whispering that 2 of Richard Garrick's personal guards had escorted her out to a closed black carriage 5 minutes ago. Jasper shoved the boy aside and ran out into the freezing night, his white hair blowing in the wind as he leaped over the stone railing of the porch. He did not have a carriage, but his vampire nature allowed him to move across the snow-covered streets with a speed that no horse could ever match. He followed the fresh scent of carriage oil and horses through the foggy air, his eyes tracking the deep tire ruts left in the slush along the harbor road. He knew exactly where Richard Garrick would take her. There was an old wooden warehouse near the end of Wharf Street that his family had used for storage for 30 years. Within 3 minutes, Jasper reached the dark exterior of the harbor buildings, the sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the wooden piers below. He could hear the low murmur of men's voices coming from inside the largest warehouse, the windows boarded up to hide the lanterns burning within. Inside the cold building, Mabel was tied to a wooden chair in the center of a large room filled with tall stacks of shipping crates. Mr. Thomas Finch stood near her, his large spectacles reflecting the light of a single oil lamp, as he counted a stack of $100 bills. Richard Garrick sat on a crate across from her, his face still red from the ballroom encounter, a small black pistol resting loosely in his right hand. He told Mabel that her father had been a stubborn man, and that she was proving to be just as difficult to handle as he had been. Mabel spat on the dirt floor near his boots, telling him that Jasper would find them before the night was over and take the ledgers to the city marshal. Richard Garrick laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the empty rafters, telling her that he was counting on Jasper showing up to save his beggar bride. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the warehouse shrieked, as the iron hinges were torn completely away from the brick wall by a tremendous force. Jasper stood in the opening, the white fog rolling around his boots, his white hair making him look like a creature born from the winter storm itself. His eyes had shifted to a dangerous burning shade, and his pale skin seemed to glow against the darkness of the warehouse interior. Richard Garrick's 2 guards raised their rifles, but Jasper moved before they could even pull the triggers, his movements a blur of white and black. He struck the first guard with his open hand, sending the man sliding 20 feet across the concrete floor until he hit a stack of timber and lay still. The second guard fired his weapon, the loud report echoing through the building, but the bullet passed through empty air where Jasper had been standing a millisecond before. Jasper appeared directly behind the man, his cold hand gripping the rifle barrel and twisting the metal until the weapon dropped uselessly to the floor. He tapped the guard sharply on the side of the neck, knocking him unconscious with a single precise movement that required almost no visible effort. Richard Garrick jumped to his feet, his hands shaking as he aimed his small pistol directly at Mabel's head, screaming at Jasper to stop moving or he would fire. Jasper froze 10 feet away, his chest not moving, his pale face an absolute mask of pure, freezing rage as he looked at the businessman. Mabel did not panic. She looked at Jasper, seeing the silent message in his dark eyes, and realized she had to create an opening for him. She leaned her weight to the right, toppling her wooden chair sideways onto the concrete floor with a loud crash that drew Richard Garrick's gaze down for a fraction of a second. That tiny window was all Jasper needed to close the distance, his hand clamping around Richard Garrick's wrist with a sound like cracking ice. The pistol dropped from the man's fingers, discharging harmlessly into a pile of old burlap sacks near the wall. At the same time, Mr. Thomas Finch tried to run toward the back door, but Mabel, whose hands had slipped free during the fall, grabbed a heavy iron coupling from the floor and swung it hard against his shins. The lawyer went down with a sharp yell, clutching his legs as the iron ledger rolled out from his coat pocket onto the dirt. The sound of the ocean waves outside filled the warehouse as the struggle came to an absolute stop under the dim light of the oil lamp. Jasper stood over Richard Garrick, his cold fingers still holding the man's wrist tight enough to keep him pinned against the wooden crates. He told the businessman that his time in Boston was finished, and that the city marshal would have the shipping ledgers before the sun came up over the harbor. Richard Garrick looked up at Jasper's pale face and white hair, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying understanding of what his opponent truly was. He whispered that Jasper was a monster, a creature that did not belong in a civilized town like Boston. Jasper looked down at him with a cold smile, telling him that there were far worse things in the world than a man who protected his family from thieves. Mabel stood up, brushing the dirt from her green silk dress, and picked up the leather ledger that had fallen near Mr. Thomas Finch's boots. She walked over to Jasper, her hand steady as she handed him the book, her eyes meeting his dark gaze with a look of complete trust. Jasper released Richard Garrick, letting the man slump down against the crates as the distant sound of police whistles began to echo down Wharf Street. He turned to Mabel, his eyes shifting back to their normal dark shade as his expression returned to its usual quiet calm. He asked her if she was hurt, his cold hands checking her wrists for any marks left by the rough ropes that had bound her to the chair. Mabel shook her head, telling him that she was perfectly fine and that they needed to leave before the city guards arrived at the docks. They slipped out through the back door of the warehouse just as the first police lanterns appeared at the corner of the street, lighting up the foggy lane. They walked quickly through the dark alleys of the back bay, reaching the safety of the brick townhouse without being seen by anyone in the neighborhood. Jasper locked the iron bolts once again, then led her into the small parlor where a fire was still burning low in the grate. He collapsed into a leather chair, his white hair looking dull in the firelight as he rubbed his temples with his pale fingers. Mabel sat on the small stool near his knees, watching him as the tension of the long night finally began to leave his shoulders. She asked him to tell her the truth about his family, reminding him that she had seen what he could do with her own 2 eyes in the warehouse. Jasper let out a deep sigh, his voice dropping to a soft murmur as he began to explain the history that Mr. Thomas Finch had tried to exploit. He told her that his family line was ancient, a race of people who lived for centuries without aging, possessing a strength and speed that normal humans could never match. He explained that he was the leader of his kind in the Northern Territories, a king who had chosen to live in isolation to keep his people safe from the growing cities. He told her that he had hidden at Silverwood Crest because he was tired of the endless struggles for power and wealth that defined both the human and the vampire worlds. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a sudden vulnerability that made him look human for the first time since she had met him. He told her that he had originally intended to use her name to protect his property, but that he had never expected to find a woman with so much courage. He said that she had faced his cold nature and Richard Garrick's threats without ever backing away or asking for safety. Mabel reached out, her warm hand covering his cold fingers as she looked up into his pale face with a soft smile. She told him that she had married a white-haired stranger to save herself from starvation, but she was staying with him because she chose to be at his side. The next 2 days in Boston were filled with the loud noise of shouting newsboys and the constant clatter of carriages outside the townhouse windows. The morning papers were covered in large black headlines detailing the arrest of Richard Garrick and the exposure of his illegal shipping operations along the coast. The articles mentioned that an anonymous source had delivered a complete set of ledgers to the city marshal, listing every bribe paid to local politicians over 10 years. The name of Jasper Montgomery was never mentioned in the stories, leaving the white-haired king and his young wife completely hidden from the public eye. Mabel watched the street from behind the lace curtains of the parlor, feeling a deep sense of relief that her father's name had finally been cleared of all wrongdoing. Jasper spent his afternoons writing letters to his associates in the north, organizing the remaining shipping lines to ensure his people were taken care of during the winter months. He moved around the house with his usual silent grace, but his demeanor had changed. The cold, harsh barrier he had built around himself had begun to melt away. On their final evening in the city, they packed their small trunks once again, preparing to take the midnight train back to the remote hills of Maine. Jasper stood by the window, watching the snow begin to fall over the brick roofs of the back bay, his white hair catching the silver light of the moon. He turned to Mabel, holding a small piece of paper in his pale hand, and asked her to come stand by the small fireplace with him. It was the original marriage contract they had signed in the lawyer's office, the paper that listed her monthly allowance and the strict terms of their arrangement. Jasper held the paper over the open flame of the candle, watching as the fire caught the dry parchment and turned the words into black ash that crumbled into the hearth. He told her that the old transaction was officially over, and that he did not want a wife who stayed with him because of a legal document or a financial promise. He pulled a simple gold band from his vest pocket, the metal unadorned but thick and heavy, and held it out toward her on his palm. He told her that this ring belonged to his mother, a woman who had lived in the northern forests long before the cities were built of stone and brick. He took her left hand in his cold grip, his dark eyes looking straight into hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world seem to fade away entirely. He asked her if she would return to Silverwood Crest with him as his true queen, not to escape the poverty of Boston, but because she wanted to build a life together. Mabel felt a warm tear slip down her cheek, but her voice was perfectly steady as she answered him in the quiet room. She told him that she would follow him to the North Woods or anywhere else he chose to go, because her home was no longer a place on a map, but the space beside him. He slid the gold ring onto her finger, its cold metal quickly warming against her skin as he drew her close against his chest. The return to Silverwood Crest was entirely different from the cold, lonely journey Mabel had taken just a few short weeks before. The large stone house was still quiet, but as the carriage pulled up the gravel driveway, she noticed a warm yellow light burning in the library windows and smoke rising from the main chimneys. Barnaby stood on the front steps to welcome them, his old granite face splitting into a small, rare smile as he took her winter coat and wished her a good evening. The interior of the house felt alive now, the heavy dust sheets removed from the furniture and the dark wood paneling polished until it reflected the glow of the fresh fires. Mabel walked through the large rooms, no longer feeling like a guest hiding in the corners, but like the mistress of a grand and peaceful home. They spent their winter evenings in the large library, the heavy drapes pulled shut against the cold winds that howled across the main hills outside. Jasper did not hide behind his desk anymore. He sat with her by the roaring fire, his white hair resting against the dark leather of the couch as he listened to her read from his collection of old books. He still did not eat the human food that Barnaby prepared, but he no longer hid his nature from her, drinking his red juice from a silver goblet, while they talked into the late hours. Mabel learned to love the quiet, steady rhythm of their life in the shadows, finding a deep security in the presence of the white-haired king who had saved her from the streets. As she sat by the window one evening, watching the first signs of the spring thaw melt the ice on the pine trees, Mabel looked down at the gold band on her finger. She thought about how her life had transformed from the cold, desperate mornings on Tremont Street to the warm, peaceful nights in this stone hall. She realized that the desperation she had felt after her father's death had not been the end of her story, but the difficult path that had led her to the place where she truly belonged. She looked across the room at Jasper, who was watching her with a soft, content expression in his dark eyes, his pale skin looking beautiful in the fading light of the afternoon sun. She knew that they would face challenges in the years ahead, that the world outside would always be a dangerous place for a man of his kind, but she felt no fear as she looked toward their future together. The future did not seem like a terrifying void anymore. It looked like a long, quiet road that they would walk side by side through the changing seasons. She knew that love was not something that happened only in the brightly lit ballrooms of high society, but something that could grow in the darkest corners of the world if two people had the courage to trust one another. She stood up, walked over to her husband's chair, and sat on the arm, resting her hand against his shoulder as the stars began to appear over the northern forest. They stayed there together in the quiet room, completely satisfied with the life they had chosen to build together in the safety of the dark woods.